Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 76 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes, and with me as always, my fellow traveller in the phenomenal field, Mr. Ken Kelly. How's the field today, Ken?
The field is phenomenal. It's good to be here. Absolutely fantastic episode 76. What can you expect, our listener? Well, we're going to start off something really important. We're going to be looking at working with clients' defenses in the counselling room. Practice Matters is a goodie today, and that's all about when we should be breaking confidentiality. Wow, that's a biggie, because that's a cornerstone of what we offer as counsellors, that confidentiality. But there are times we need to break it. Rory's going to be examining that. Important to know. And then we're going to be closing off looking at something that so many people cover in their coursework, no matter what their modality of study is. And that is the key principles of the person-centered approach to counselling. Because even if it's not your main modality, you're probably going to be doing some kind of a comparison on that, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just good to refresh ourselves again. I know there'll be a lot of people this time of year maybe writing case studies or doing assignments. So we're always here to help. So it might just jog your memory.
Indeed. So active on the Facebook group have been so many people, so many questions, so many discussions. As here in the UK, we start the approach, the downhill approach to the end of the academic year. So assignment talk is rife, but so is practice talk, where people are in placement, and a really interesting conversation. And just so that you can join in these conversations, if you're listening to this, you're not a member of the counselling group, there's close on 17,000 like-minded individuals, students of counselling from all around the world, tutors, people in practice that come together, and we talk about the good stuff. And you can join in that discussion by going to Facebook, putting in the word Counselling Tutor, and you'll find us. We're right at the top. Knock on the door. We will let you in. But we're talking today specifically from the group. We've lifted the topic of working with client defences. What might we see, Rory, to understand that a client has got defences up?
Well, I think I'm going to start with one of my favourite quotes, Ken, from John Schleen, who was one of Carl Rogers' students who went on to write a massive body of work in its own right. And he wrote his principles of therapy. And one of the principles was, he said, everyone knows everything. We may have denials, cover-ups, overloads, lapses of memory, but we are the ultimate source. And within that deeply phenomenological statement is a universal truth that at the heart of everything, unless someone is seriously mentally unwell or is under the influence of drugs or alcohol or something that alters the mind dramatically, we all know what the truth is. We all know our truths. And sometimes we defend ourselves against looking at them. What I'd say to people is that sometimes we work with clients and it's quite obvious that there's something they want to talk about or something they want to change, but they don't want to. How do we work with that? Do we challenge them? Do we wait? It can be so tricky, Ken, can't it? It can be so tricky.
It can, and I worked for some time specializing in drugs and alcohol, and there we see it so often where somebody would present for treatment, and they would do so because of how their life looked at that time, the pain that they were feeling in their life, maybe the pain that they were causing others. And they would see that very, very clearly. Would they see what was going on and how life was falling apart for them and the troubles that they were facing? That was what presented them at therapy in the first place. But when presented with what they would need to go through, the self-concept that they would need to challenge to overcome that, it was interesting to see. And I guess this is why the recovery rates are so low in alcohol and drug abuse, is there was a massive resistance. There was a backing away. I want the results. I want this to go away. I want to feel better, but I'm struggling to challenge myself. I'm struggling to actually face up to that I know. And those are the defenses. And they shoot up. And once those defenses do go up, it can be like just hitting against a brick wall, I guess, in some cases. And of course, I'm speaking specifically about that very specific drugs and alcohol there.
Yeah, that particular client group, but it is universal, Ken. I think with a lot of clients, and you never guess who helps us out with this. Uncle Carl Rogers, he helps us out. And this is where the 19 propositions really come to the fore. I know that people say, oh, the 19 propositions, they drive me absolutely crazy, if I can use that on a podcast for mental health, but yeah, drive me absolutely crazy. But there are 2 propositions that are really, really helpful. And remember, the 19 propositions are Rogers' theory of human personality and how it can change. So that's a good quote for your assignments. But there's 2, there's 15 and 16. And I paraphrase. In 15, it says that the more people are kind of stuck, the more rigidly they'll hold on to the self-concept.
Yeah.
In other words, they become more defensive if they're overtly challenged. However, Proposition 16 goes on to say, in the absence of threat, clients can change. Again, I paraphrase. So in other words, if you're offering the core conditions, or those 3 facilitative conditions of empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard, and certainly UPR, being non-judgmental, it is possible, and we see it through the arc of therapy, that clients become less defensive. They're more open to sharing those things that are very difficult for them to change, and look at them and examine them in the therapy room. And as such, change occurs. It connects into another one of Rogers. When I accept myself as I can learn and change. He had it covered in every way, didn't he, Ken?
He did. It's one of my favorite quotes, that when I truly accept myself as I am, do I have the ability to move, to change, to move from where I am at. And it's interesting because the key concept there is the self-acceptance, the seeing it in self and accepting it. Because I guess part of the defense structure is a non-acceptance of that part of self. We can have parts of self, and when we study to be counselors, psychotherapists, we're encouraged to look at self. And every now and again, I know I certainly found some things within self that I couldn't accept. I couldn't accept that I was that way. It was I just couldn't accept it. There it is. And without acceptance of it, there's no way of moving past that. If you look at Rogers's theory, that's what he's saying there. Only when I truly accept that this is how I am, do I have any ability to change. It's almost a paradox. In fact, he starts that quote by saying the curious paradox is, if I remember correctly. So it's that acceptance. And you spoke about the 19 propositions, and you spoke about that threat-free environment. I love those words, threat-free environment. And Rogers gives us a recipe for creating a threat-free environment, and it is called his 6 necessary and sufficient conditions. If we use our facilitative conditions, the empathy, the unconditional positive regard, and I can't believe I'm forgetting the third of the...
Congruence.
Thank you. And congruence. Good job I'm not on writing an assignment right now. That is providing that threat-free environment, that threat-free, I'm not judged, I can bring myself as I am, and there's a fellow human being here, is fully accepting of that. And it challenges the incongruence of, but I'm not fully accepting of that part of self, but here is a fellow human being who is unconditionally accepting me as I am. And that creates that threat-free environment. And you know, this all ties in because we are covering the key concepts in person-centered therapy as our last topic on this podcast. 19 propositions, Rory very wisely brought in there. And Rogers also discusses it in the 7 stages of process, where we move from that rigidity, that stuck, that defending our actions and blaming it maybe on others, to going through to being that more fully functioning person, acting from a place of fluidity and acceptance of ourselves and others. Interesting stuff.
It is, Ken. And one final plea. If you have a client who is defensive, honor those defenses. You know, go gently. Those defense mechanisms will have kept them surviving in the world. They're like a life raft on a bobbing sea of incongruence. And honor those defenses. Don't deflate the life raft. You know, because it's a little. The analogy is that someone can be on a sea in a very poorly constructed boat, but they're still above the water. And if you start to kind of deflate or put holes in their self-concept, they may very well sink. So honor the defenses, be patient, and just watch the UPR. Just be non-judgmental and just see what happens. It's amazing.
It is. A question comes up for me as you're saying that, Rory. So you went into this topic saying, when we see these defences, how do we work with that? Do we challenge them? And I guess what you're saying there is if there is challenge to be had, it needs to be gentle challenge, and that it is about the client finding their own way around their own defences, not our job as counsellors to show them the way around or to tell them how to do it or to point out what those defences are, but for the client in that threat-free environment with maybe gentle challenge, with reflection back of what they're saying, pointing to the incongruence, finding their own way. Oh, I love therapy talk. We could go on all day, Rory.
We could. Very well put, Ken. We could go on all day about it, but you'll find defence mechanisms and defences, and as Roger's called it, incongruence, a lot in the therapy room. Be gentle, be kind, be patient.
Love it. So moving on, practice matters, a really important part of our podcast. I know that we get so much feedback on practice matters because why? Practice does matter. And these are the things that we're likely to come up against when we're in practice that we're going to be glad we heard on the Counselling Tutor podcast when they come up. And the cornerstone of counselling is confidentiality. When we're speaking about the threat-free environment that we've just discussed, threat-free environment means I can bring anything and I know that that's going to be kept confidential. But there are times we need to break confidentiality. And today you're going to be walking us through when we need to break that confidentiality.
I am, Ken. I'm going to be sharing with you the kind of exceptions to confidentiality and why we have them, and also talking about why those need to be in the contract. So two things there: the exceptions and how the client needs to know them. And I'm going to be talking about that in depth in the next section.
Practice matters.
Before I start this segment of the podcast, I'm going to offer an apology, and it's an apology to those of you who are listening outside the UK. I know I have a number of listeners who tuned in from all over the world. Hello to you. Thank you for listening. And the reason I'm apologising is I'm going to be talking about exceptions to confidentiality in the counselling relationship, specifically here in the UK. But hey, don't tune out. Stay tuned in, because I'm also going to be talking a little later on about the importance of having a good contract, and I'm sure that's going to be universal no matter where you live. So confidentiality, I think it's an interesting place to start of what that word really means. And confidentiality isn't secrecy. What confidentiality is that you agree with your client the limits of what you can share with others, and that is usually right at the beginning of therapy and should be in your contract, which in my opinion should be a written contract and a signed contract, so there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever. Here in the UK, there's a programme called Judge Rinder, where a man called Robert Rinder, who's a barrister, chairs a court that's on the TV, a little bit like Judge Judy, but kinder, I think. And one of the things that he talks about a lot, if you watch his programme, is contracts. If it's not written down, it doesn't exist, is the narrative that comes out of a lot of the programmes. So having a contract's really important. It protects you, it protects your clients, and a little more of that later on. So what are the laws that govern confidentiality here in the UK? Well, there's really three laws that are pertinent. The first is the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Now, this has been redrafted and new law added to it through the years. But the Prevention of Terrorism Act, there's absolutely no justification for somebody who's a therapist not to disclose anything that could be terrorist related, and for very good reason, because terrorism it can cause harm to lots and lots of people. So that's terrorism and anybody planning terrorism. And if someone was in your practice who was disclosed that, you would have to break confidentiality. The other law is drug trafficking. Now, it's interesting what drug trafficking is. It was explained to me that selling small amounts of cannabis or drugs, illegal as it is, I have to say, would not constitute an automatic breach of confidentiality. However, trafficking large amounts would be. So we're talking about people who are bringing in huge amounts, shipping them in, maybe in containers or lorries or that type of thing. That would be an area to breach confidentiality for. And if you're not sure, I would always say check with your supervisor or check with your ethical body. If someone, there's no actual weight of drugs in law, but it's generally seen as someone who's trafficking huge amounts. The other is money laundering regulations. Now, money laundering is where someone has sold a huge amount of drugs and has a big suitcase full of cash and cannot put them in the bank because the bank may very well ask, where's that money come from? Money laundering regulations are really strict. So what some people do is set up a legitimate business and try and launder the money, the clues in the name, make it clean through that business. So I'll give you an example. Someone's got £100,000 in cash, drug money that they've sold drugs for, and they open a fish and chip shop, and then they launder the money through the business, pretending they've sold £100,000 worth of fish and chips. And then they can legitimately put it in the bank. So in those cases, you would have to break confidentiality, and you would probably need to speak to your supervisor. But those are definite, hard and fast rules. But what about other laws? What about someone who steals something? Or what about someone who is selling small amounts of drugs? How would you deal with that? Well, I think it's really interesting because as it stands, there's no legal obligation for therapists to disclose low-level crimes. There are exceptions, and I've just kind of outlined them, but generally speaking, not. But I do know that sometimes therapists have to break confidentiality because clients may be harmed to themselves or others. So an example of that would be a few years ago, I had a colleague whose client turned up to a session really under the influence of alcohol, obviously struggling, but the worry was that the person had driven to the appointment and they were going to drive home again. And my colleague said, look, I can't let you drive home and just leave your keys. Can I call you a cab? Can I call someone to pick you up? And it was, no, I'll be okay to drive. And my colleague took a principled view that having someone driving under the influence of alcohol isn't a good thing. They were very seriously under the influence, very unsteady on the feet. So the police were called, and regretfully the person was arrested for drinking and driving. And again, the court would say that's a principled breach of confidentiality because there's harm to self and others involved in that. What else where we might have to share information with clients? Well, the other area is if a client wanted their own information. So under the 1998 Data Protection Act, which is going to be superseded probably by the time this podcast goes out by the General Data Protection Rules, or GDPR, which is going to come in force Europe-wide in May of 2018, clients have the right to access their own notes. So anything you write down, any correspondence, the client has a legal right to access it. What about courts? Or what about if there's a divorce, client's going through a divorce, and as a consequence, the partner solicitors phone up and ask for your notes, would you give them away? Well, the answer to that is no. The only people that can access your notes is a judge with a court order, a coroner in regretful circumstances where someone's died, a client's died, or the client themselves. That's it. And I have had cases where the police have contacted me asking me for my notes, and I have very cordial relationships with our colleagues in the police. They're just doing their job. They go through a procedure, and I politely say to them, well, I will, if the client wants the notes, I will give them to them and they can pass them on. And in some cases they say, well, the client's not willing to have the notes given up, and then I respectfully say, well, I'm afraid you have to get a court order in that case, and they say fair enough, and they've done their job and I've done my job, and I make my notes and they make their notes, and everybody knows exactly where they are. Now, there are certain exceptions to confidentiality that come with working with some client groups. So I had someone contact me today who's going to work with the yacht team, youth offending team, and they asked me about confidentiality, and I said that they'd really have to contact their liaison there, because some organisations, certainly working with offenders, there are specific advice from our Home Office, which is a legal entity, a legal entity within UK law, where you have to take certain advice. It's the same if you're working in a drugs rehab with people who are in recovery or in active addiction. You may very well have to take advice on that, because there are difficulties there. And one of the difficulties with working with someone in active addiction, certainly in a rehabilitation unit or a rehab, is that if they are in a rehab, they'll almost certainly be getting prescribed medication to manage the drugs cravings. This is specifically prevalent if somebody is using heroin and or an analgesic, which is a painkiller, and they may be given a substitute to manage that. The difficulty is if they top that up with street drugs, they could very well kill themselves. You know, it's sometimes referred to as going over. People could have a heart attack and die. So in drugs rehabs, you would have part of your contract which would have that exception to confidentiality. So what about writing the contract? How do we get across those exceptions to confidentiality? How does that work? Well, it's all about having a contract. And in terms of a contract, I have a written document, and within that are the limits of confidentiality. They're clearly written down, and I make sure the client understands them before we get into any therapy. It's really, really important. And I would strongly suggest that you write down a contract and you put the limits of confidentiality in there. And the reason for that is because if you have to break confidentiality, you've got a written record of it. So my contracts are signed by both myself and the client, and out of respect for the client, usually at the next session, I say, I just want to check if the contract is okay and that you understand the limits of confidentiality. Super important, because if we have to break it, we may have to justify breaking confidentiality to an ethical body or even a court. And if we do that, then the more evidence we have, and the more evidence of our defensible decision making we have, is really, really useful. I also get a lot about working with children. What is the limits of confidentiality of work with children? Well, surprisingly enough, at the time this podcast is recorded, there's no legal obligation for someone, and I'm going to make the distinction here in private practice, to break confidentiality if a child discloses they're being abused. May be really surprising to people, but that's just how it is at the time this podcast is recorded. However, and it's a big however, most child therapy is under an organisation such as a school or professional organisations, and within those organisations, their own policies take precedence. So if you work for a school or you work for a young people's charity, in their policies and procedures, they will have it written down what the exceptions to confidentiality are. And this causes no end of confusion for students, because they say, well, I've got the BACP ethical framework, and isn't that the whole thing? Well, the answer is no. The ethical framework is a baseline of confidentiality. It is quite principled to then put more exceptions to confidentiality in. So, for instance, if you work in a drugs rehabilitation centre, that confidentiality may be broken if somebody discloses that they're using street drugs. If you're working in a yacht team, a youth offending team, or working as a counsellor within children's services, it could be principled that you could break confidentiality if the child discloses they're being abused, or if the child discloses that they're stealing things. The key here is that the person who's the client understands the limits of confidentiality. And that is why it is so important to have it in a contract. So there you have it, Counselling and the Law. There's a really good book by Peter Jenkins, who teaches, I believe, at Salford, which is not very far away from where I am here at Counselling Towers. And I'll put a link into that book. It's really useful. And as always, if you're struggling with issues of confidentiality, speak with your ethical body, speak with your supervisor, take a view from your tutors if you're in training, and remember that the contract is your safety net. It protects you as much as the client.
Thank you as always, Rory. So insightful. And confidentiality, something we need to understand. We need to understand when to break that. And of course, as Rory very put over so well there, we need to, the client needs to be informed beforehand in the contracting stage of where the limitations in confidentiality lie. Rory's super duper handout available to you right now. So how do you get it? Well, if you're a member of the CSR, which is the Counselling Study Resource, then you can just log in, and that has already been uploaded to your handouts vault. No need to go to the website and download it. If you're not a CSR member, you can still have the handout. You can have it with pleasure. You just go to counsellingtutor.com. That is our website, counsellingtutor.com. At the very top of the page, there is a menu bar. Click on podcasts, make your way to episode 76, and you can download Rory's super duper handout from there within the page. And if you're listening to this and thinking, well, what is this CSR, this counselling study resource of which I speak? We'll have more information on that at the end of today's program. Just stay tuned. And that is basically, it's our paid for section of Counselling Tutor, where we have hundreds and hundreds of resources that Rory has written and curated for students to help you on your travels. But more about that at the end of today's program, because we need to move on with the content, and we're looking at the key concept of the person-centered approach to counselling. Over to you, Rory. I know it's one of your passions.
It is. He's a favourite of mine. He's the Oak Park man, as I refer to him, because he was born in Oak Park, Illinois. And yes, the basic concepts of person-centered therapy. Well, one of the criticisms that Rogers comes under, and it's continuous, is that his theory is very elegant. In other words, it's kind of very, very diluted. There's not a lot of great depth in it. But what there is speaks of a universal truth, I think. So let's look at how we grow up. We grow up, and as children, we get messages from our parents. Don't put your fingers in the electrical sockets. Don't drink bleach. Don't cross the road when it's full of traffic. All very wise counsel, I think, and guaranteed to keep you alive. But we also may get messages from our parents that are not so helpful. You know, a boy falls over, scuffs his knee, starts to cry, and someone says to him, "Big boys don't cry." Or a girl or woman, well, it'd be a girl if it's a child, may be told that they have to behave ladylike because they're girls. And these are what Rogers called introjected values. In other words, they're values from other people that are literally placed into someone and said, these are your values. These are what you have to do. Nothing to do with you. This is what you have to do. And with that comes conditions of worth. We're going to place these values into you, but they're in there, and as long as you're doing what you're told effectively, you'll get love. And if you don't, you won't get the love. So those are introjected values and conditions of worth. So we go through the arc of our life, and then what happens is the lad who fell over and cut his knee and is told not to cry may very well have a lot of difficulty expressing emotion, because he's told in his past, well, you got to man up. You've got to stick your chest out, straighten your back, all that kind of thing. And that creates the incongruence. In other words, what he really wants to do, his organismic self, which is another one of Rogers' phrases, that part of him that has been programmed and conditioned, and his real self, who wants to have a bit of a cry and a weep, they're at odds. And that creates incongruence. And it'd be the same for the little girl. She grows into a woman, and she decides that maybe she doesn't want to wear a dress, a frilly dress. She wants to wear jeans and a T-shirt, and she may not want to dress in a inverted commas. And if you can see me on the webcast, I'm doing inverted commas like mad. feminine clothes. Again, that could cause an incongruence. And it can be that what happens is that people struggle with who they really are and who they were told they had to be. That's when people present in therapy usually.
It's interesting, and it makes so much sense that it makes sense to me. You started off by saying there's almost a universal truth to this, and it does. It rings true that when we are born, the organismic self, the true self, that who we really are, it's untainted. No messages have been added to that. And as we grow up, we're given those messages. And the example, I loved your example of the girl that is told that she has to act in a feminine way. And maybe years later, when she wants to wear jeans and do rough and tough things, which is her choice, maybe there's a part of her that thinks, I shouldn't really be doing this. I don't know why it is, but I feel a bit bad. I don't feel free. That this doesn't feel 100% right. And that is the fight. That is the incongruence going on inside, because a value that was introjected, given to her when she was a child, is now conflicting with who she knows she is. And that fight happens. And so often when a client comes and sits in front of us in the therapy room, they can so often say, I'm lost. I don't know who I am anymore. Because they're told who they should be from their boss at work. They're told who they should be within their relationship. They're told who they should be as they're growing up from their parents. They're told who they should be from their schooling. And we're told who we should be by the media that we consume. But the television tells you what car you should be driving, what perfume you should be wearing, what alcoholic beverages you should be drinking. We're told all of this information, and it's no wonder that people get lost, that feel that incongruence and are unable to tap in and trust. And this is the important bit, unable to trust their own feelings. Because everything, and here's another one of Rogers's theories, is value from an external locus of evaluation. What do they say? What do they think? If I do this, what will the people think? What will the people say? And the process of person-centered therapy is to free that internal self, to shed off the introjected values, the conditions of worth, to be accepting of self for who we are, warts and all. And in that is the freedom, dropping of the incongruence, and being who we are and trusting that that is enough, that is okay. It doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter what they think. It matters what I say, and it matters what I think.
Absolutely. And there's a very famous quote, isn't there? It's from Roger's book, A Way of Being, his final book before he went on to do his work in encounter groups and travel the world. And he said, experience for me is the highest authority. It's not the parables or the, Ken's just holding a copy of A Way of Being up. It's not the parables or the work of Freud. It's to my own experience that I return again and again in the process of becoming. What a wonderful quote. Not the full quote, because he said, my experience is fallible, therefore it needs to be checked in new and primary ways. He covered those bases. He was basically saying, my experience may tell me this is right, but actually sometimes I might have to take a view from someone else just to check that what I'm seeing is correct or what I'm experiencing is correct. And that new and primary way, of course, he was talking about therapy.
And it's interesting. We're talking about what are the key concepts of person-centered approach to counselling. And I guess we can add in right at the beginning, if you're writing an assignment, that it is based in humanism. It's based in that belief that all humans are born good, that we're not born bad or naughty, and there's the world and the messages that we receive that kind of warp how we perceive the world. The concept of self, another one of the terms that is used. And of course, Rogers also wrote the 7 stages of process, where he tried to track the different processes that somebody might go through in therapy as they move through from being pretty rigid to being more fluid and accepting of who they are. So the rigid side would be everything is everybody else's fault. I take no responsibility. If you had a job like mine, your life would be like this. If you were in a marriage like mine, if you'd had a childhood like mine, it's very blaming. Everything is externalized to stage 7, where it's full acceptance of others, their opinions, their opinions differing from yours is okay as well, and of self, that is that fully functioning person. And of course, we mentioned the 19 propositions at the start of today's podcast. So 19 propositions, Rogers' theory, personality theory, is it, Rory?
Yeah, it's Rogers' theory of personality. It's how our personality, how we develop and understand the world and our place in it. And I'd just pick up on what you're saying about humanism. I think sometimes it's misinterpreted that people are all born good. I think a better way of putting that is people are born ethically neutral.
Oh, I like that.
And I bought a book on existentialism and humanism, and it says that people are born ethically neutral. In other words, a child's born with no real concepts of right or wrong. That is something that society programs in.
I like that. That's, if I was writing an assignment now, I'd be writing that down, Rory. Humanistic, meaning
ethically neutral.
Ethically neutral. Get that in there. That's for the assignments. That is, everyone.
Yeah. So and Rogers did say that any move away from that was not. I'm not going to use the word normal, but I think that's what I'm trying to say. Not normal. It was an aberration. That human beings are basically cooperative and basically survive in the world because they are cooperative, and anything outside that is the aberration of the human condition. So it's not quite that everybody's born good. They're born ethically neutral, and we adapt or take in the ethic or the behaviour of those around us.
I like that, and I absorb that you've shared there, and that's part of the journey, isn't it? To have a thought or a belief, to get new information on, to not be defensive, but to be open to challenge of that belief, and then to weigh up the new information and see if that fits and change that belief. And that kind of keys into how we started today, with clients working with their own defenses. This is episode 76 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We then went on to when we may break confidentiality in the counselling room. And of course, we closed off with a really good section for your assignments, because if you listen back to this and you just write down all the little bits of key theory that either Rory and I mention, you've got all the key theory there for your assignment. You just join it together with the ands, buts, and of course expand on that. So hopefully that'll be useful. That is the key concept in person-centered therapy. Great episode.
Yeah, and as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take care. If you enjoy the topics and handouts here on the Counselling Tutor Podcast, then you will love the Counselling Study Resource. CSR was built by myself, Ken, and Rory Lees-Oakes to give you the support you need during your counselling studies. So get access to the world's most comprehensive collection of resources aimed at supporting you in your journey to become a counsellor. Take the stress out of your studies by visiting counsellingtutor.com/CSR. That's counsellingtutor.com/CSR.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.